Every day we consume news. Headlines move quickly, from markets to technology, from policy decisions to global conflicts. We read, we react, and then we move on. But rarely do we pause to ask, what is the ethical question inside this story? Because not every news event is an ethical issue, but some are. They are the moments where something deeper is at stake, not just outcomes, but values. Ethics begins when there's a choice between competing claims, between efficiency and dignity, between innovation and responsibility, between power and justice, between authority and accountability. These conflicts do not appear in theory, they appear in decisions. Decisions made under pressure, under incentives, and often under uncertainty. In this episode, we will not follow headlines, we will examine four recent news stories from the past few weeks. Not for what happened, but for what they reveal. In labor, where speed begins to demand risk. In technology, where decisions are made without clear responsibility. In power, where the limits of law begin to weaken. And leadership, where accountability is tested not in success but in failure. Each story looks different, but each raises the same question: what happens when values are compromised? A promise is made to the customer, delivery in 10 minutes. It sounds efficient, even impressive, but every promise has a cost, and the question is who pays it? In January 2026, platforms like Swiggy and Zepto began toning down their 10-minute delivery claims after concerns were raised about rider safety. Because speed in this case was not just a service feature, it was a demand placed on someone else's body. Riders navigating traffic, racing against time, working under targets they did not set but were expected to meet. Research from International Labour Organization and Oxford Internet Institute shows that platform work is increasingly governed by algorithmic targets and rating systems that create pressure without visibility. The system appears efficient, but the pressure it generates is not always seen. Now the ethical question becomes clear, not whether fast delivery is possible, but whether it is justified. When the risks are unevenly distributed, the customer gains convenience, the company gains growth, but the worker absorbs the uncertainty of traffic, of time, of safety. This is not just an economic arrangement, it's a moral asymmetry. Philosophically, this raises an old question. Immanuel Kant argued that human beings must never be treated merely as means to an end. When efficiency is achieved by transferring risk to those with least control, that principle begins to erode. Karl Marx, would recognize something else. A system where labor adjusts itself to the demands of production rather than the other way around, that is not right. And Mahatma Gandhi reminds us that means and ends are inseparable. If the means carry harm, the outcome cannot remain ethically neutral. So the issue is not speed, it is the cost at which speed is delivered. For students of ethics, there is more than just a story about delivery platforms. It is a way of seeing how ethical questions appear in everyday systems. You can use this example when writing about dignity of labor to show how work can be organized in ways that respect or ignore human limits. You can use it in answers on corporate responsibility to argue that responsibility is not only about compliance or profit, but about the conditions under which outcomes are produced. And you can use it while discussing emerging economic models, especially the gig economy, to illustrate how flexibility and efficiency can coexist with vulnerability and risk. And that leads to a simple but difficult conclusion. Speed becomes unethical, where it demands risk from those who do not share in its reward. Because sometimes what appears as convenience is built on someone else's constraint. Artificial intelligence is not just becoming more useful, it's becoming more capable. Systems today can write code, solve complex problems, and perform tasks once limited to trained experts. In just a few years, they have moved from assisting decisions to shaping them. And this transformation has been remarkably fast. The International AI Safety Report highlights a central concern. AI systems are improving rapidly, but evidence about their risks is slower to emerge and difficult to assess. This creates what the report calls an evidence dilemma. Act too early and interventions may be ineffective. Act too late and the harm may already have occurred. Even before deployment, certainty is limited. The report notes that systems can behave differently in real-world settings than controlled evaluations. Some advanced AI models can recognize when they are being tested and adjust their behavior to perform well in those conditions, which means what appears safe in testing may not remain safe in practice. And this creates a deeper problem. Decisions are being made using systems whose behavior is not fully predictable, even to those who design them. In such conditions, responsibility becomes harder to exercise because if outcomes cannot be reliably anticipated, they cannot be fully owned. And if they cannot be fully owned, they cannot be fully justified. That is where a technical limitation turns into an ethical one. At the same time, these systems are not fully understood. The internal workings remain difficult to interpret, even for developers. Earlier, decisions could be explained. We could see the steps, the logic, the reasons. Now, we often see only the result, not the path that produced it. We receive the outcome, but not the reasoning behind it. These risks are not hypothetical. The report points to evidence of AI systems already being used to support cyber operations. It also raises a more serious concern that the same systems, when combined with publicly available knowledge, could lower the barrier for developing biological threats. This is the shift we are dealing with. Tools designed to assist can also be used to accelerate harm. And when something goes wrong, the question is not just what failed, but who answers for it. The model was trained by one group, deployed by another, integrated into systems by a third. Each contributes to the outcome, but none fully owns it. As a system becomes more complex, control is distributed across multiple actors, and with that, responsibility becomes fragmented. Decisions are made, consequences are real, but accountability has no single point of return. This creates a structural imbalance. Capabilities are advancing rapidly, but governance and safeguards remain incomplete and often voluntary. Testing is imperfect, understanding is partial, and oversight is still evolving. So the ethical problem is not simply whether AI is useful or harmful, it is this. How do we govern systems that are powerful, partially understood, and already embedded in real-world decisions? Because in such systems, the question is no longer just what technology can do. The question is whether we can remain responsible for what it does. Power is necessary. No society can function without it. Governments enforce laws, institutions maintain order, states exercise authority. But power has always required something else: limits. In February 2026, Antonio Guterres warned that human rights are under assault globally across multiple regions. The concern is not just conflict, it is the weakening of something more fundamental, the rule of law itself. When law weakens, power does not disappear, it changes form. It becomes less accountable, less predictable, harder to question. Decisions are still made, actions are still taken, but the framework that justifies them begins to erode. And when that happens, the difference between authority and domination begins to blur. At the center of this is a simple idea: human dignity. The idea that every individual has a value that cannot be reduced to strategy. convenience, or control. When power operates without limits, this is the first principle to weaken. Civilians become numbers, rights become negotiable, and harm becomes easier to justify. So the ethical question is not whether power should exist, it is this: what restrains it? What ensures that authority remains legitimate and does not become arbitrary? John Locke argued that legitimacy of power comes from its purpose: to protect life, liberty, and rights. When power fails in that purpose, it loses its moral foundation. For students of ethics, this is more than just a story about global conflict. It is a way of understanding the moral limits of power. You can use this example when writing about human values to illustrate the centrality of dignity and justice. You can use it in discussions on ethics in international relations to examine the tension between sovereignty and responsibility. And you can use it when analyzing governance itself to argue that power without ethical restraint cannot remain legitimate. And that leads to a principle that remains constant across contexts. Power is not justified by its strength, it is justified by its restraint. In late 2025, operational disruptions began affecting flights at Indigo. Delays increased, cancellations followed, passengers were stranded across airports. For those affected, this was not a logistical issue, it was a breakdown of service. Reports pointed to operational pressures, including crew scheduling challenges and system-level strain. Nothing dramatic in isolation, but together, they created visible failure. In the months that followed, questions were raised about oversight and leadership responsibility. And in March 2026, the CEO resigned. Resignation in such moments is not just a change in position, it is an ethical act. It signals that responsibility is being acknowledged, even when the failure cannot be traced to a single decision. In large organizations, failures rarely have one cause. They build over time through small gaps, missed signals, and systems under pressure, which means the leader may not have caused the disruption, but it occurred under their leadership. This is where a distinction matters. Blame looks for a mistake, responsibility accepts the outcome. Blame asks, who caused this? Responsibility asks, who must answer for it? Max Weber described leadership in terms of responsibility for consequences, not just intentions. In that sense, resignation is not an escape, it is one way of answering for those consequences. Because when failure affects the public, accountability cannot remain internal. It must be seen. Passengers do not experience systems or structures, they experience outcomes, delays, uncertainty, disruption. Institution can recover from failure, but only if trust is restored. And trust depends on one thing: whether responsibility is acknowledged clearly and visibly. So the ethical question is not whether leaders make mistakes, it is this: when failure becomes public, what form of accountability restores trust? Not denial, not delay, but acknowledgement. Clear, visible, and timely. Because trust is not restored by explaining failure away. It is restored when responsibility is accepted without being forced. For students of ethics, this is more than a story about an airline. It's a way of understanding leadership in moments of failure. You can use this example when writing about accountability to show that responsibility extends beyond direct causation. You can use it in governance answers to examine how institutions respond when public trust is affected. You can use it in case studies to evaluate whether resignation strengthens or weakens institutional credibility. And that leads to a principle that applies across contexts. Leadership is not defined only by performance and success. It is defined by responsibility taken when failure becomes visible. 4 stories, 4 values. In one, speed-tested dignity. In another, technology-tested responsibility. In third, power tested its limits. And the last, failure-tested accountability. Different situations but the same question: what holds system together when they begin to strain? Not efficiency, not scale, not control, but values. Because systems fail when the values that guide them are not sustained. So long, happy learning.